Hello, I'm Andrew Garden. A few weeks shy of his 80th birthday, I interviewed John Seed, an internationally respected forest campaigner and activist, a deep ecology teacher and mentor, co-founder of the Australian-based Rainforest Information Centre, and with the late Joan O'Macy, they founded the Council of All Beings. John, like me, is a singer-songwriter and poet, and in 1989, he and I were involved with a few other folks in getting Pegasus networks off the ground. Pegasus was Australia's first nationally accessible and community-focused internet provider. In our conversation, we reflect on our memories of Pegasus's founder, the late Ian Peter, and we talk about some of John's earliest uses of email and how this grew into numerous international campaigns that halted significant illegal and controversial forest timber logging operations and held international aid and development agencies accountable for their support of such practices. All of this before the World Wide Web. Here's my interview with John. Mr. John Seed.
Mate.
Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise, Andrew.
Thank you for making the time to do this.
Good. Important.
John, when I first met you, I was introduced to you by Milo Dunphy.
Goodness.
You had just come back from overseas. There was a press conference at Milo's office. I was about 27 years old. I'd set up a organization called Roundhouse Communications, and we were doing media releases and try to help NGOs with sort of publicity and creative ways of reaching and communicating to the public. And Milo said, "You've got to meet this guy, John, who's been doing amazing work in the Amazon and various other places. And we've got a press conference. He's just coming back. You arrived barefoot, and I'd never met anyone who had travelled the world barefoot." And
I'm sure I might have arrived at Milo's office barefoot, but I'm sure I wasn't travelling the world barefoot.
Okay. Well, you made quite the impression. And I think, because I'm sort of joining the dots, because I spent quite some time with Ian Peters' archives, and that's a whole other story. But around that time, and this was before I met Ian and before I knew anything about Pegasus or EarthNet, it was early to mid 1989, and Ian had established or got involved with a few people to do an international campaign using email around the banning of rainforest timbers.
Yeah.
Do you recall that?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you recall about those early days?
Oh, well, just how exciting it was to use the internet as a way of organising. I mean, perhaps I don't remember so much about that particular campaign, but maybe you'll be interested in the first internet campaign that we were part of was one where we were approached. We just started Pegasus, and we were approached by Bruce Rich from the Environmental Defence Fund in Washington, D.C., who were wanting to start an international campaign to reform the environmental policies of the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks. And as we were the only NGO in Australia with an internet connection with an email address, they asked us to join, and so we did. And that was that was extraordinary, and it ended up with that I ended up in Washington, D.C. for the first direct action against the World Bank's environmental policies. And Greenpeace was dropping banners off their building, and I wrote a song to commemorate, I wrote the World Bank song. which I can send you a link to if you're interested. It's still true, most unfortunately. And we were able to make considerable changes. But perhaps the most important part of that was that we discovered that Australia's contribution to the multilateral development bank, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-African Development Bank, was 15% of Australia's aid budget, whereas 85% was run by our own International Development Assistance Bureau, which is now called AusAid, and it had exactly the same policies as the World Bank, same environmental policies, because there was a revolving door. Someone would be working in the World Bank one minute and next minute they'd be working at AusAid. And so then we started a campaign to reform AusAid's environmental policies. This was after Carol Sherman, who was running that campaign, went on. She wrote a book about the World Bank, which you can still find it. It's in the National Library or somewhere. I don't know. I haven't got a copy. But anyway, so we went after the Australian government's Development Assistance Bureau, and we pulled together a coalition of both environment groups like Greenpeace and Australian Conservation Foundation and so on, and aid development assistance groups like Freedom from Hunger Campaign, Community Aid Abroad, Australian Council of Churches. And we made a letterhead where half the letterhead was all of these different organisations' letterheads at the top of the page, and half the page was there for whatever we were going to write. And we successfully demanded a Senate inquiry into the impacts of the Australian government's the environmental impacts of AusAid. And that Senate inquiry came back supporting all of our claims about changes that need to be made. And as a result, AusAid was required to do environmental impact assessments before it could start a project for the first time, and was required to obey Australian environmental laws, even if working in a country that didn't have its own environmental laws. But to rub salt into the wound, the Senate then demanded that AusAid start a new funding window called NGOEI, NGO Environmental Initiative, and offer $1 million a year to NGOs to create new standards of environmental excellence in the delivery of Australian aid. Rick thought we'd have no chance of seeing any of that because we'd been the main thorn in their sides organising this campaign against them. But on the contrary, every proposal that we put over the next 2 or 3 years before that funding window was closed, they accepted, and we realised that they wanted to put us into a situation where we would stop harassing them because we didn't want to bite the hands that feeds us. And so we created AidWatch. Carol Sherman, who had been running the whole campaign, both the World Bank and the AusAid campaign, left Rick and joined Lee Rhiannon and started AidWatch in order to continue to harass AusAid. And we went ahead and had amazing projects that saved literally millions of hectares of rainforest funded by the Australian government in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and then in Ecuador, in India, even in Siberia. It was amazing. Not rainforest, of course, in Siberia, but long story.
Yeah, those are really fascinating trajectories. And what I find interesting about that is that in amongst all of that, ADAB was actually helping to fund some of the networking projects that we were running with PACTOC, with Lee Rhiannon's support, into the Pacific Islands, Bougainville, Sarawak, and I think in East Timor as well.
Wow.
I've still got the original proposals that Ian and I wrote and sent off to ADAB, and they were very, very supportive of those. I'm not even sure they were aware of what was what we were doing, but they liked the idea that modems were going to these places and that they were enabling access to health, legal aid, and so on and so forth. But there are obviously many other slash human rights slash environmental causes and operations that were taking place, campaigns that were taking place at that time. I also remember that I think Rick had a Indonesian national who was taking modems into Indonesia, crossing border from Kalimantan into Sarawak. Do you recall any of that?
It vaguely rings a bell. I'm wondering whether um, one of the people that was working with Rick at that time was a strange fellow named Petra Fagel, and
Mm-hmm.
he was especially involved in the Penang campaign. And he wasn't an Indonesian national, but he popped up again after decades and sent us some of his memoirs, which is now on. If you go to the old Rick site and go to archives, you can see Petra's memoirs about Sarawak and all those those times. So he might if you're looking for more information about that, he might know, or else Patrick Anderson, who is working in Indonesia all the time now, like that's his full-time thing.
I wasn't aware of your involvement with AidWatch, with that trajectory, because I had a fair bit to do with AidWatch for quite well. We were managing their communications and websites, and once that sort of picked up, but yeah, that's really fascinating how interconnected all of that work was. Carol and Lee were just you know absolutely dynamite as a team. I remember meeting Carol when she was working on those dam campaigns in India.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and she would pop over to the occasionally to the epicenter in Byron Bay with her laptop, and we'd try and sort of figure out how to improve her email access and so forth. It was pretty fascinating.
I got a message this week from her son Made, and someone's writing a book about the Franklin Dan campaign and about the young people that were there, the kids that were there. And Made was wondering if I had any photos of him down there at that time, which I don't. But
Wow, that's a fantastic story.
the campaigns I wrote for was the World Bank, and then I wrote one for the Solomon Islands, and then I wrote one called Extinction, which was written at the Daintree during that blockade and mentions Cape Trib and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, just going back to EarthNet, uh, correct me if I'm wrong. Were you one of about 10 or so individuals and organisations that contributed a small sum to get that project up and running?
I believe so. I mean, that was very much Ian's wheelhouse,
Yes.
but I'm pretty sure that that's the case.
Yeah, because I came across some documentation. I remember him mentioning that there was about 10 individuals and groups that put up. I mean, it was a modest sum of around $250 each just to sort of get the paperwork across the line.
Yeah.
And then he met Andrew Campbell, who was involved in some funding these sorts of interesting initiatives without a sort of profit motive at the end of it, and then that got Pegasus off the ground. Do you recall any other particular campaigns of note where communications was just really critical, international communications, email, and so forth?
Yeah, so once again, this is one which I'll tell you my version of the story, but if you want a more complete version, Patrick Anderson's like 15 years younger than me, and his memory's in a lot better shape. But basically, we were in we were in the I was going to say the former Soviet Union, but it was the Soviet Union then. We were doing a lot of both conservation but also deep ecology workshops, and only later realised that this huge surge of interest in deep ecology in the Eastern Bloc was really that the whole movement towards the breakup of the Soviet Union was building up, and but it was unsafe to organise politically around those things, and so the people, they met and created environmental organizations and met for environmental workshops and things like that. And that was the cover under which all these other conversations could take place. But anyway, we were Patrick and I and Bill Pfeiffer from the Sacred Earth Network in Massachusetts were in Russia together, and we no. Okay, so this was right after the breakup of the Soviet Union. This was right after that, when the economics was totally insane. So that we, for instance, caught a flight from Moscow to I'm trying to remember the name of the city in the east, in Siberia. Is it Khabarovsk? Anyway, I can look that up. But anyway, it was right across, I don't know, 6 time zones. And um, we paid a normal airfare to get across, but the airfare that we paid for the fuel for the whole trip. Everybody else on the flight paid like $15 for the flight because that's all they could afford. And like it was just totally insane. And it being so, like that, we picked up an internet expert in Moscow and took him with us. We paid for his trip because it cost nothing. And so when we got to the other side, Hyundai was threatening, had started logging Vladivostok. That's where
So,
we flew
yep,
to, and
yep.
then we drove from Vladivostok through endless forest to this village, which was being threatened by logging from Hyundai, and we couldn't find anyone in the village. And we looked around everywhere, and finally we saw that everyone was in a meeting in the big hall, and they were meeting to discuss what to do because Hyundai bulldozers were at the top of the mountain, and they had just decided that the hunters were going to go up there with these ancient 19th century firearms, and they were going to take on the bulldozers with their ancient firearms. And there was one phone in the village, and our Russian techie hot wired our laptop into that phone line, and we were able to get an action alert out around the world, which ended up within 24 hours in stopping Hyundai from starting that logging operation, and it stopped the armed confrontation of these villagers with the bulldozers. So I'm pretty sure that all of that is accurate, but you would get much more of the details from Patrick.
Okay, that's an extraordinary story, John.
Have I lost you?
No, I'm still
You're
here.
frozen.
Okay.
Back again? Yeah,
Yes.
back.
Yeah, we're back. I got the end of the story.
It's never changed.
No. Where are our Russian um,
That's right.
technical support people when we need them? Yeah.
That's right.
Do you remember when you first met Ian Peter?
Well, yeah, I do. Which is that it was during the Nightcap campaign. I was putting out the first issues of the World Rainforest Report, just mimeograph. Do you remember that technology?
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
and someone said, "Oh, you can do that with a computer now." And I said, how do you do that? And they said, "Oh, well, you just attach a printer to it, and then you don't have to correct anything because you correct everything on a screen." And you don't use whiteout anymore or anything like." I said, "Wow, that's amazing." And I said, I wonder if there's one around that I could. And they said, "Yeah, there's one guy in Lismore that would probably let you, show you how to use it." And so I went down to Wotherspoon Street, and I know, yeah, that's right. Ian was living in Wotherspoon Street, but he was still. I think that he hadn't long broken up from, I forget her name, but the mother of his boys,
That's
and she was living in Pine Street, and he was living in Wotherspoon Street, and I stopped in there, and he was very generous, and he showed me how to use the computer, and I did an issue of, I think the second issue of the World Rainforest Report was done on the computer. And I was so excited, and I could just, and Ian was just feeding me all the possibilities of how this might. And so I got an arrangement with him where he rented me a room in his house and let me use his computer as much as I like. And so I moved into Wotherspoon Street, and I started living there in Wotherspoon Street with him. And then I don't remember what year, but not long after that, within a year, I guess, the house next door was for sale, and it was up for auction. And I went to the auction, and the minimum price, whatever that's called, was set at $19,000, and it didn't sell. And I was like flabbergasted. And so I just scratched around and found out that I could do it. And so then I offered them $17,000, and they accepted. And so I bought the house next door, and you know, um, jacked it up 3 meters so that it was out of the flood. And that's where the Rainforest Information Centre's first headquarters came from, after starting in Ian Peters' spare room.
wow. Ian, one of the last telephone conversations I had with Ian was a few months before he passed. He was saying that period of meeting you really saved him from severe depression.
Oh, interesting. I never knew that.
He was suffering terribly from the breakup, and he said spending time in the forest, the founding of Rick, meeting John Seed was really just feeling emotional. Just remember, was really transformational for him. It was really quite something.
Oh, well, thanks so much. That's an important little piece of news.
Yeah,
Because I mean, it certainly changed everything for me,
yeah, yeah.
and it was like an amazing partnership that um, really made a difference.
Because before he arrived in Lismore, he was. Do you know about his history with the ABC?
Now that you mention it, I vaguely remember, but I wouldn't have remembered if you hadn't told me.
So he was involved in the ABC orchestra. He was a consummate trumpet player. So he was working as a session musician, but at the ABC orchestra, they realised that he had these, really good organisational skills. And I found in his archives all this information where he had coordinated the first visit of the Chinese Opera Company into Australia. He organised the tour, got them over, raised the money, really extraordinary work. And then he organised a tour, very early tour for the Little River Band. So he was doing these really interesting but very, very different types of projects, and moved up to Lismore to take up a position at the community radio station.
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that maybe all the old early correspondence between me and him, all those files still exist, but they're word star.
Right.
And it's like I've looked into it a couple of times, and it's not straightforward to remove the control characters and make it kind of make it palatable. That's
legible. Yeah.
something that I'd like to do one of these days.
Yeah, yeah, it would be really interesting. So, and what would be actually that would be amazing because I've been working with the Wikimedia Foundation to establish an online archive of Ian's records. So they're nearly finished with this whole scanning and annotating project, and the idea would be to feed in additional information. So all of those these stories and additional materials that you have would really fill into this to it, more than just the Ian Peters story, but a story about Australia's contribution to sort of activism and the sort of electronic landscape, the digital landscape that really, is barely known or barely understood here
Yeah,
and abroad. I speak to a lot of
yeah,
people who are internet aficionados and historians and whatnot, and as far as they're concerned, it all started in the States. The well is
yeah,
about the well. The whole Earth network is about as radical as it gets. And when I start to mention your stories and some of the other stories and Sarawak and the work we were doing with Pack Talk, it just blows their mind, because they have
yeah,
no
yeah,
idea.
yeah,
And the
yeah.
work that was being done in the Philippines in the early 80s with Roberta Bazzola and People's Access is just wild. It's really fascinating stuff.
Wow,
Um,
wow, wow.
so, I mean, my intention is to hope that these stories kind of rise into the currents of firmament of activism within young people's movements. So where I teach and I talk about a lot of this stuff, it just blows students' minds that there was this level of really concentrated, focused work in Australia and the Pacific, and it just sort of spread. And I think that we can learn a lot from that. So this leads me to the sort of next part of the discussion. What I'd like to talk to you about is recently I saw a video where you were talking via Zoom, I think, to a whole bunch of people in Taiwan.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and you were saying just how amazing it is that you can do this now. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, I mean, so I'll just start by saying that um, while my activism, environmental activism continues, and I was arrested 2 weeks ago at Rising Tide for swimming, and I swam out, and but police boat intercepted me before I got to the coal ship. So and I was arrested last year, locked onto a what they quaintly call a harvester, and stopped logging for a day in glider habitat and so on. So I'm still into that, but um, it's clear to me, as it has been clear to me for 40 years, that without a fundamental change in consciousness, none of those things is going to be able to um, hit the brakes on the mass extinction that's been taking place. And so that's deep ecology. And so I'm mostly focusing on seeing how I can move deep ecology more and more into the mainstream. And um, part of that is spreading the ideas, but Arnie Ness said that ecological ideas won't save us. It's got to be ecological identity, ecological self, and that's the change in consciousness. And he said we need community therapies to heal the illusion of separation that's driving this slide to oblivion. And so that's, working with Joanna Macy and others, I've been developing and facilitating these. I stopped traveling internationally about 15 years ago, used up all my carbon, but still flying around in Australia. But then this year, I just decided not to do that anymore. And for the first time started, but by then I'd already had probably 30 people that I've been training as facilitators in the last 5 years. And so I started doing workshops this year where I would organise the workshop, I'd publicise the workshop, I'd Zoom in for a total of 6 hours over the course of the weekend, but other people would be on the ground doing the facilitation. I would do poetry, I would do introductions, I'd sit in on sharing circles and so on. And it turned out that these workshops were absolutely as profound and successful as the ones that I participated in. So that was a great discovery, because it meant that I could start working outside Australia again. And now I'm organising workshops in the United States and in Europe that I'm going to do next year in that fashion. And so, but it's, I guess, like in Taiwan, Taiwan might have been the last overseas trip that I did. So that was no, it wouldn't have been the last one. Yeah, maybe it was the last one. It was 2012, so 13 years ago, and I was invited over by a professor of anthropology who I'd met in Australia at a conference, and he invited me over to because he saw the footage from Earth First about how we stopped the dam on the Franklin River, flooding of the rainforests in southwest Tasmania. And he told me that Taiwan had beautiful rainforests and that were being threatened by dams, and that there were, I forget how many, like some extraordinary number of distinct indigenous groups in Taiwan living in the mountains who were opposing these dams in the mountains, of course. And could I come over? And I was like, could I come over? And so we went around these villages and I showed them the films of how we stopped the Franklin Dam. And but then, the Society of Wilderness organised a deep ecology workshop in the capital, and I did that. And so anyway, they've been doing councils of all beings ever since, which I didn't know. I mean, I'd lost touch with them. But they got in touch with me again to say, could I give a talk about that? And I said, of course. And so then last week, they wrote to me and said, oh, a whole bunch of us want to come over and do a deep ecology workshop with you at Narara. And I wrote back and said, oh, no, I'm trying, no, absolutely not, but I didn't know. So I said to them, and it's true, that unless someone is really proficient in English, it's not only difficult for them, but it makes it really difficult for everybody else in the workshop. So how about someone else flies over from Australia and I'll Zoom in for 6 hours? And it looks like that's going to happen, And so that's the, I'm fishtailing across the ice, and, I keep, my own experience is that the quicker that you fail at whatever you're doing, the faster you move forward. It's never in a straight line, but the more you zigzag in approximately the right direction, that seems to be the only way to get to anywhere. And so I don't know whether this is going to end up being, viable, but that's where I'm up to at the moment.
I think all the different efforts that are taking place. It's a chap called Douglas Rushkoff who he has a very similar kind of approach, and it's interesting that he's working from his angle. He's working specifically around about raising consciousness amongst technophiles. There was an interview you did on Radio National. I think it was in the spirit of things. There was a point towards the end of the interview where you talked about hope, and you said that you didn't believe in hope, and you had a completely different take on what hope meant. And I sort of wondered whether or not that kind of aligns with a recent quote, I've got it here somewhere, of Greta Thunberg, where she says, the one thing we need more than hope is action. Once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So instead of looking for hope, look for action. Then, and only then, hope will come.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can't remember what I said, but I wish I'd said that.
Exactly. Well, you were asked, do you have hope for the future? And you said, I don't believe in hope.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But I think from memory, it was very similar in terms of you can't have hope unless you have action. There's no point. Otherwise, it's just they're just words. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Every year, I meet a new generation of young people, and this past year, every one of my students have not this past year have not experienced a life without a smartphone. Um, and I'm very aware that you and I are of a generation that lived before the internet. You know, when the phone would ring and you'd run to it.
It's long distance.
Yeah, exactly. Or a telegram would arrive, and there'd be a hushed tone in the whole house because a telegram was usually a sort of foreboding of a family in the old world, that family member that had passed away. Um, you Some of us, I didn't see a television set until I think it was 1969. My dad got a TV set, just hired a TV set just so that we could watch Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. And then
Yeah, yeah,
then it stayed in the house.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But that was an interesting moment because it was the first time I got a sense of a common humanity. You
yeah,
know, and like the communications has this sort of electronic communications has this capacity of bringing people together around a common theme, a common idea, a common hope, if you like, a common sense of I guess the type of things that you talk about in deep ecology, a sense of consciousness, a sense of kind of a sort of global sense of consciousness. Given this context, um, what can present and forthcoming generations learn from us? What do you think present forthcoming generations can learn from us? What is our experience? Or what is your experience for the people who are or will deal with, the really complex issues, the really complex concerns um, that will impact all the systems that we rely on to sustain every aspect of life?
yeah. Well, I'm not sure. Like, I guess the first thing that comes to me is maybe they can learn endurance. That they can learn that. You know, um, we've both been going hard for a long time, and it's not because we were buoyed by great success. My life has been a record of failure. All the dreams that I had for the conservation of nature lie in ruins, and I still can't find another game in town. And so I continue to throw myself into the fray. Um, and I think that that's going to be really important. That's going to be a really important model, because I don't think that young people are going to find success any easier to come by than I have. Yeah. But
Mm.
other than that, I'm not sure. Like, I feel a little, how to say, I was given one job, which was to take deep ecology and to spread it as far as I could. And it was clear to me right from the word go that until everybody understood this, nothing I was going to receive nothing more. It's not like I was going to have some great new idea to push out there. It's just like, no, you've just got one job, and this is it, and just keep going. And so I guess the other thing then that maybe I would have to teach would, so this isn't so much, I can't talk about people of my generation, but I can only just talk about what's been given to me. And that is, um, it's a kind of, it stems from deep ecology, but what it is I feel like I'm just following orders. Do you know? I can't say exactly where my orders come from. Sometimes I can use a metaphor like Gaia and say, okay, the truth is that every cell in my body is descended in an unbroken chain from the first cell of life on Earth, and that I am like one tiny cell in the organ, in one tiny cell in, humanity is like one tiny cell in the 30 million species. Sorry, what is it? Um, 30 million species. I think so. I think it's 30 million species. Um, and uh, and so, like a cell in a human body, in an embryo, like a fertilized cell, you know, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and away it goes to a trillion. But at a certain point, one cell just starts to migrate in a certain direction, and another cell goes in a different direction. They both got exactly the same DNA, but it expresses differently, and one of them's going to become a liver cell, and one's going to become a brain cell. And they're just following orders. They're not thinking, oh, I think I like liver, they're just following orders. So to
Mm.
the extent that we can drop the arrogance of thinking that we can control this thing, and to the extent that we can surrender to the fact that we are a plain, simple member of the biota. We're not the crown of creation. We're not the apex of the pyramid. We're one tiny strand in the web, and we follow the same orders and get orders from the same place as everything else does, then some kind of coherence can start to emerge in our lives where when we consciously surrender to that again and again and again, a kind of a kind of I don't know, coherence emerges in one's life, and I, I don't know quite where to go from there, except to mention a song of Leonard Cohen's that has been working away at me for a few years now, written late in his life, and it's a song that's not in his voice, but in the voice of where he gets his orders from.
Mm.
And the voice starts saying, I love to speak with Leonard. He's a sportsman and a shepherd. He's a lazy bastard living in a suit. But he does say what I tell him, even though it isn't welcome. He doesn't have the freedom to refuse. So this is where, this is the voice of the song. And the song says, he will speak these words of wisdom like a sage, a man of vision, though he knows he's really nothing but the brief elaboration of a tube. So Leonard knows that he's just a worm from his mouth to his asshole, and he'll speak these words of wisdom as though they're his own, but he knows where they're coming from. They're coming from me. And so then it says he'd like to write a love song, an anthem of forgiving, a manual for living with defeat, a cry above the suffering, a sacrifice recovering, but that's not what I need him to complete. Sorry, Leonard. I know that's what you want to do, but fuck off. And then it says what it wants of Leonard, and it says, I want him to be certain that he doesn't have a burden. So that's the first thing. He's going to die shortly and he can't take it with him, so he'd better drop it now. I want him to be certain that he doesn't have a burden, that he doesn't need a vision. He doesn't need to know what's going on because I'm going to tell him what to do. What would he need a vision for? That he doesn't need a vision, that he only has permission to do my instant bidding. You know, that's all that he's got to do is just listen, and I will tell him what to do from moment to moment. And he can forget about what I said to him yesterday. It's instant bidding. It's right now. He's just got to listen to what's coming to him right now, and that's all he's got to do. You know, and so I just like that just rang so true to me, and so not as though it told me how to do it, just as though it put into words, clarified my own experience of how things are for me, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think that is an important thing that Leonard has to teach and that I have to teach and that maybe old men have to teach. I'm not sure.
I'm really, really grateful, John, for you to, share your wisdom. Great story about Leonard and his piece.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and
Yeah.
I just sort of feel like there's something valuable in both the content and the spirit of the thing.
I just remembered one other thing. The second time I actually met you face to face was at Rick, and and I was trying to remind you of our first meeting with Milo Dunphy, but by that stage you'd only known me by my Pegasus handle, which was Agaton or Agaton, and you said it reminded you of
Agaton.
Agaton, and you said it reminded you of a Greek character from, and I can't remember where it trailed off, but I just stood there and my jaw kind of dropped a little bit, and I thought, there's a lot more under the hood of this man than I could ever know if he's referencing, Greek literature, because I was reading Greek literature in the early 80s when I was hanging out with my daughter's mum. At Sydney University, sort of hanging out in the library and just like, oh my goodness, what's this? So I really appreciated that. You really helped to open my mind around the possibility of, not possibility, but it's always important to suspend one's assumption about anyone. People are. Here we go. Leonard Cohen. We are multitudes.
Well, I love it that you're, keeping Ian Peters' work alive as much as you can, and it just gives me one more reason to have another, like claw back some space to have another look at those old WordStar files, and I'll see what I can find. Maybe put them into some format that's searchable under Ian Peters' name.
Yeah.
I know it's possible. It's just, anyway, it's just
Yeah.
that the inbox is endlessly full and that the lists never get to the bottom of the list. But the sort of WordStar issue has just moved up the list a notch. Thanks so much. Thanks a lot, mate.
Thanks. Thank you. Lots of love. Bye.
Emanating from expensive business suits, do you notice odors foul and rank? With his ecocide, genocide numbers game, here comes the World Bank. Vampire needle dripping dollars, clutching his structural adjustment knife. Ecosystem after system is plundered and laid to waste as from the earth he sucks the life. Secret vital organs from the living earth, spitting out cellulose chips. How generous he greases all his minions' palms, his coffee's ecological collapse. Economists from hell smooth the way, run interference, quelling all your fears. With administrators, bureaucrats just doing my job, and all those damn engineers. World Bank's got an evil junkie wife, goes by the name of IMF, shoots up biological diversity, dispenses cultural death, mumbling about sustainable development. She plies her vicious trade, and if you see her coming, better run for your life. There's an S on the end of her A. Asian, African, American development banks are World Bank's ugly cronies three. With their friends, the scumbag loggers from the FAO and the mafia from the UNDP. They loot the biological register with their tropic forest action plan. Scorched earth transmigration, chemicals, agribusiness, logging mines and dams. Propping up corrupt third world elites, choke the rivers with endless dams. Keeping all them foreign experts employed with their paid for by your taxes scams. Rape the earth to meet the interest payments. It's that same old shell game. Centuries of exploitation, and they still owe us colonialism by another name. The time has come to clean up this town. Name names, flush out those crooks. Biological fabric in tatters. The World Bank crooks the books. Wake up now, won't you hear the cries of this planet of your birth? Expose the lies, no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. I said stop the lies, no compromise in defense of Mother Earth.